morning, everybody, and good evening. Good morning to Cameron, to Dr. Cameron Bailey, who's joining us today, and he'll be presenting about magic and Tibetan Buddhism. Cameron was a student at Oxford University where he did his PhD, and then he worked in Korea, and now he's focusing on his magnus opus, which is a book about Tibetan deity protectors. So he's been to our lecture series in London in the past. I remember at SOAS University many years ago, you gave a talk, and then more recently one about your thesis, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Very interesting, Lelungship Dorje and sexuality, let's say, uh, to state it in one sentence. But anyway, it's a pleasure to welcome you back for the third time then. And the talk will last about an hour, and at the end of which we can have some questions. So if you have any questions or if you would like to type them in the chat, we can see them after that. So welcome everybody, and thank you, Cameron, for being with us today.
Okay, hello. Thanks for the great introduction there. I'm Cameron Bailey. I got into studying Tibetan Buddhism. Gosh, it's almost 20 years ago now. And I've always been kind of interested in the sort of stranger, weirder aspects of Tibetan Buddhism, the kind that doesn't necessarily get as much attention in the typical presentations of Tibetan Buddhism in the West, at least not in a kind of a positive way anyway. So I kind of always gravitated towards the protector deity cults, and specifically, and also the kind of related to that, the use of various magical rituals in Tibetan Buddhist practice. I remember the first talk I gave, the SOAS talk that Jamyang there alluded to, was also on magic. So I feel like I kind of gone a little bit full circle here. But my thinking and how I relate to the subject is definitely changed since I made that first presentation. So today, before we get into talking about actual magic in Buddhism more generally, and also Tibetan Buddhism specifically, I thought it would be kind of good to talk about the category of magic in general. And kind of this question about what do we mean when we say magic? What is magic exactly? So I think if I asked you to kind of define magic, to yourself, we would all, if I asked the group what is magic, we would all kind of come up with fairly different answers, perhaps, but I think there would be a lot of commonalities in how we would define it. Magic is in fact used very commonly in vernacular, but it's often used without really any kind of precise definition in mind. It's one of those terms where, like religion, you know it when you see it, but when it comes down to actually trying to define it specifically what it is, it can be very difficult. And because of this, in academia and like the social sciences, the term magic is kind of a very contested category. It's to the point that it's actually quite controversial, or some people kind of talk about it like it is. And part of the reason for this is that it's often, the term magic and the use of the term magic is often criticized for having too much cultural baggage, that it can't really, or it shouldn't be really applied to cultural contexts outside of Europe. where, there's we have the term magic in English and related words in the other European languages. But the idea that we can use the term magic or the category of magic to look at non-European cultures is often heavily criticized. And a big part of that is the way that magic has been used historically as what I kind of gloss here as an othering tool, a way to put down essentially other cultures by categorizing their practices, their beliefs, what they do as magic, in contrast to the good stuff that we do, which is religion or science, as the case may be. So they have magic, which is, basically primitive superstition, and we have science or religion, depending on the context. And this was the way that the term magic was used in specifically colonial scholarship when looking at India and Tibetan cultures, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, as a kind of a implicit criticism or a denigration of those cultures. Now, when we talk about magic and the theories of magic and definitions of magic, the names, there's a few names that usually come up. The kind of early 20th century theorists of magic, who are extremely influential in how the term magic came to be used more generally in scholarship and academia. There are a number of these, early thinkers in the social sciences, but the two names that usually come up in connection with the term magic and definitions of magic, or at least they come up the most often, I would say, are James Frazer and Emil Durkheim. They're kind of the most influential theorists of magic in academia, I would say. And nowadays they're usually discussed in terms of how incorrect or how wrong their definitions of magic are. So they're usually brought up now in order to criticize what they thought about magic. Yeah, usually when you talk about magic in relation to Tibetan Buddhism, for example, you have to kind of cite Frazer and cite Durkheim and then say basically how they're wrong, right? But so I'm not going to get too deep into what their specific ideas and definitions of magic were, but I did want to kind of bring up 4 points about magic that later thinkers who were influenced by Frazer and Durkheim, I think to a lesser extent, more sophisticated definitions of magic, and basically 4 criteria for defining magic, and specifically defining magic in contrast to religion. So just to go through these 4 kind of quickly, the first way, the first criteria for how magic differentiates from religion is that magic specifically is manipulative. You are manipulating forces or deities, and essentially forcing them, coercing them to do what you want. Whereas in religion, you're praying for something to happen. You're asking a god or a deity to grant you something, right? Whereas in a magical ritual, on the other hand, you're forcing the deity or just some kind of impersonal force to do something for you. And that brings us to the second point, which is that magic is impersonal. This idea that there are sort of just natural laws of the universe that you can kind of that are completely impersonal, that you can just tap into to cause some kind of magical effect. Again, this is in contrast to, or thought to be in contrast with religion, where you have a kind of a personal relationship with a deity, right? Third point is intention. Magic is intended to be, supposedly, according to this definition or this understanding of magic, magic is intended to be, it's geared towards short-term goals, tangible short-term goals, like generating wealth or winning the love of a woman or, killing an enemy, something like that, something that's very precise, tangible, that you can kind of measure, right? And this is in contrast to religion, where the intention is much more intangible, long-term salvational goals, right? The fourth point is so-called social evaluation, where supposedly the idea is that religion is good in that it promotes social cohesion, but magic is antisocial. And this is actually a big thing with Durkheim's theory of magic, right? Magic is like it's something, it's very personal, it's very almost egotistical, right? And yeah, again, antisocial. It's your own, it's promoting your own selfish wants and needs, that kind of thing. Now, when you actually try to apply these four criteria for our understanding magic to how what we want to call magic is used in actual societies around the world, they break down pretty quickly. The sort of this theoretical hard and fast line between religion and magic, it seems really good on paper, seems to make sense on paper, but when you actually look at real world practices, it doesn't work. The line between religion and magic breaks down pretty quickly, and we'll maybe talk a little bit about that more when we get to discussing specific types of magic in Tibetan Buddhism. Now, like I was saying a minute ago about how magic is often criticized as a category because it's it has this cultural baggage. It was used historically as a way of denigrating other cultures and othering other cultures. So for that reason, some modern scholars are very uncomfortable using the term magic. That's not the only reason necessarily why they don't like the term, but that's one of the big reasons. My attitude, however, is that there are plenty of sort of intellectual resources in the European culture specifically, for understanding magic, excuse me, as a positive thing. So, for example, during the Renaissance and the early modern period, the occult and esoteric tradition that developed in Europe thought of magic as being something quite positive. Magic is cast as being like the wisdom of the ancients, and they didn't, necessarily divide, see religion or science and magic as being opposed at all. Quite the contrary. Magic was thought of as being, in some sources at least, as being essentially the integration of religion and science, or what was called natural philosophy. And also magic, the term magic was often used, and the category of magic was often understood to be a kind of exceptional and specialized form of religion, rather than being this thing that's kind of opposed to religion. And this sort of Western esoteric, or Western occult idea, um, fits or matches Tibetan Buddhism, and specifically Tantric Buddhism, very well. I think there's a lot of very good parallels there, a lot of useful parallels we can draw there. Um, because the use of magic, or things that we are tempted to call magic in Tibetan Buddhism, essentially function as specialized rituals within religion, rather than being in any way opposed to religion. So that's kind of this more positive occult esoteric understanding of magic is kind of how I'm using the term magic. Now, before we dive into Tibetan Buddhism, or Buddhism specifically, another or one more kind of understanding of magic that I think of is particularly useful or helpful is, that kind of ties together the kind of the negative understandings of magic as well as the positive understandings of magic, right? Magic as being this thing, this kind of this weird thing that other people do, versus the kind of the specialized practices that are, the kind of the almost seen as like the pinnacle of religion, rather than being anti-religion, basically. So in both those cases, in both the positive understanding of magic and in the negative understanding of magic, there's this sense that what magic is a kind of a discourse about alterity, about things that are extraordinary, right? Magic is the thing that extraordinary people do with a kind of extraordinary knowledge, using extraordinary ritual to cause some kind of extraordinary effect, right? Um, Usually when we talk about magic, we think of magic as being, you have this special person, like a magician, or a sorcerer, who's quite different from the ordinary, like a common Joe, and he has access to specialized knowledge. Like there's special knowledge of special spells that only he knows, or only his tradition knows, and he has these special techniques that he uses to cause manifestations in the world, effects in the world, that are supernatural, or super normal. I actually prefer the term super normal. So again, it's this idea that magic is a kind of a discourse about alterity, about strange stuff that people do, to cause some kind of or to have some kind of supernormal power, essentially a superpower, or to cause some kind of supernormal effect in the world. Now, whether, of course, whether or not you believe in magic or not, if you even if you don't, there's this the idea, of course, that there's this, the person thinks that this causes some kind of supernatural effect, when they do this sort of special secret ritual, right? And again, this this discourse about magic as being a kind of a deviation from the ordinary, um, in terms of creating, specialized knowledge and creating a special effect. That can be in a positive or negative sense, right? It can be, it can be a priest who knows like certain special rituals to cause, or has special power to create, to heal people, or it can be some evil sorcerer or witch who, has these special rituals that they do to kill people, for example, right? And it can be either positive or negative. Okay, now that we've talked a little bit about how we can think about what magic is and how we can use it as a kind of an analytical category, um, let's talk about specifically about Tibetan Buddhism and also words. First thing I want to talk about is words in Buddhism that are basically I think of them as extremely hard to define without some kind of recourse to the concept of magic, right? Um, they're uh, they're typically defined as magic when scholars are trying to translate these terms, they usually use the word magic in some way in the definition. Um, and I would submit that in order to properly translate these words, especially to a general audience, you kind of have to use the term magic in order to get the meaning across. Um, so in that case, if we understand these terms as being similar to or parallel to magic in Western esotericism or Western understandings of magic, um, then in that case, we can say that Buddhism has had a close relationship with magic, from the very beginning. Basically, in the Pali Canon, for example, we get discussion of what in Sanskrit is called riddhi, or in Tibetan zutral. Um, these are paranormal abilities. You could call them superpowers or supernormal abilities that advanced meditators are, people who are accomplished in these deep meditation practices that the Pali Canon, that early Buddhism promotes. These are powers that the advanced meditators or advanced practitioners gain, that have the ability, supposedly have the ability to do. Now, these supernatural abilities, these magical powers are kind of treated as sort of byproducts of the um, Buddhist spiritual path. Um, like they're not really the end goal, but they're things that are often described as you're definitely going to get them. They're signs of progress on the path, and they're considered to be particularly useful tools, especially when converting people to Buddhism, right? Because you can show them your supernatural power, impress them, and that kind of is a way of winning converts. Um, and now there's a kind of a standard list of these supernatural abilities, these magical abilities, like flying through the sky, sort of being able to phase through solid objects. It's described as being able to dive in and out of the earth as if it's water. Things like reading minds, being able to see other realms of existence, stuff like that. Now, when we get to the the Tantric tradition, the later, Tantric Buddhism, the focus on gaining or developing, or we could say producing magical powers is even more pronounced in Tantric Buddhism. In fact, in Tantric Buddhism, the rituals of Tantric Buddhism are modeled after magical rituals, and a lot of tantric scriptures, tantric texts are basically grimoires in the sense that they're collections of magical spells, basically. And we'll look at some specific examples of what those are, at the end here. So in Tantric Buddhism, in early Buddhism, these supernatural powers are called riddhi. In Tantric Buddhism, they're called siddhi, or nudrup in Tibetan. And these are the powers that great tantric adepts, practitioners of Tantric Buddhism, who are called siddhas, they're the magical powers that they possess, and the list there's a kind of a standard list of these magical powers, and they're kind of similar to the much earlier Buddhist list of paranormal abilities, the riddhi, stuff like flight, special. There's like a special eye ointment that you can put on to see, to see invisible things and stuff like that. There's some differences, but there's also a lot of crossover from early Buddhism as well. Another term that is often translated as magic, or in relation to the term magic, is chirtrul. Chirtrul is the kind of a simple definition is magical manifestation. And it it kind of has a sense of like a kind of a magical illusion, that kind of thing. And it's actually, in the context I've seen it used, it's strongly connected to the basically the liberative knowledge, or the gnosis, that is necessary to achieve full awakening, full enlightenment in the Buddhist tradition. So again, there's this idea, just like in early Buddhism, that when you make spiritual progress, you kind of automatically have this ability to cause magical effects, right? These super normal powers. The I was going to say something else about that, and I lost my train of thought. Oh, yeah. So for example, there's this interesting passage in one of Atisha's texts. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with Atisha, but Atisha was one of the extremely important systematizers of Buddhism in Tibet, kind of in the late first millennium, early second millennium. And he there's he's very highly regarded in all schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And he's often specifically connected to doctrinal questions about how Buddhism should be properly practiced, and things about proper motivation for practice, bodhicitta, kind of the altruistic motivation, that kind of thing. But in in one of his more famous writings, he has a line about how one should try to quickly develop magical powers from by practicing in deep meditation practices, you should try to develop these magical powers as quickly as possible, because that way you can actually help people. You can aid them in a kind of as a bodhisattva, much faster that way. You're much more effectively that way if you have these magical powers. And again, that goes back to this idea, when we were talking about on an earlier slide about, magic is selfish, religion is, more about social cohesion. Well, that's clearly not the case in the Tibetan Buddhist context, because in these magical powers that you gain on the spiritual path are meant to be used in an altruistic way. And in fact, they are the best way that you can, be able to, improve people's lives, simply put. Okay. Now, speaking on that, these magical powers that tantric adepts, that practitioners of tantric Buddhism, are meant to be able to use in order to improve people's lives, ideally. There are 4 types. There's this kind of a standard list of 4 types of magical action. Sometimes they're kind of described as 4 types of Buddha activity, or 4 types of enlightened activity. But when you look at Tibetan Buddhist magical texts, the different types of practices can be kind of broken down into these 4 categories. So it's just kind of the standard way that they group them. Now in Hindu Tantra, there's a more extensive list of 6 types of magical action, and there are other different types of categorizations where there's more types, but in this kind of the standard Tibetan Buddhist list, there's 4 of them, which are pacification, enrichment, overpowering, and ferocity, or wrath, depending on how you translate drak. Now, pacification would be things like, healing, or causing, people's, preventing conflict or something like that. Protection, protecting a village from a marauding army or something like that. That would be an example of pacification. And then there are there's various techniques in Tibetan Buddhist magical ritual for, like, making a village invisible so that a hostile army will pass by it without noticing it, stuff like that. Then there's enrichment, or you could say augmentation, and that's usually related to wealth, right? As enhancing wealth, or making sure that crops grow properly, or that your animals are healthy, that kind of thing. Then we get into the second 2 categories are the kind of the more interesting, I guess you could say, that are more often highlighted or talked about when in relation to when discussing Tibetan Buddhist magic. The third category is overpowering, or you could just say is power. And this is basically forcing someone to do what you want. What's known as erotic magic, sometimes called love magic, but love really doesn't have anything to do with it. It's erotic magic, basically kind of forcing, a woman or man to be attracted to you. That's a very common example of overpowering magic. And again, all remember in the normative practice of these kinds of rituals, all these various like erotic magic, they're meant to be done with an altruistic mindset, right? Ideally. You can wonder about how that's necessarily possible with some of these practices, but that's the rhetoric is that these practices are meant to be done with a kind of an altruistic bodhisattva intention. And then finally, we have ferocity, which is direct harm, bodily harm, or to a target, a specific person, sometimes maybe a hostile animal, as a way of at least injuring them, if not outright killing them. Um, and I'm not going to get into very deeply into I'll talk a little bit more about it, but I'm not going to get too deeply into um, the kind of the issue of compassionate violence um, in Tantric Buddhism. But again, the ideal here is that um, this these kind of fierce, hostile magical practices are meant to be done as a kind of a last resort, and are meant to be done with an altruistic intention. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that's kind of possible. Like what does it mean to compassionately kill somebody, right? Okay, a couple of other terms that I want to bring up is in the Tantric Buddhist context, sometimes there's discussion of these kind of two related terms. They're kind of a binary. Tole versus melee. And if you want to kind of um, strictly translate these terms, you could say that tole means higher action or higher activity, and melee means lower activity. So tole refers to practices that you do basically on behalf of yourself in order to gain liberation from samsara. It's kind of an inwardly focused thing that you that are, it's like ethics and meditation practice, and things like that you do to benefit yourself, to free yourself from the round of rebirth. Melee, on the other hand, are things that you accomplish after you become awakened, that you become enlightened, or at least in the kind of the way that Tantric Buddhism is practiced. You kind of pretend that you're enlightened, right? You kind of assume the form of an enlightened being, even if you're not necessarily completely enlightened yourself. Um, and so you do these melee practices to benefit others, to kind of um, put your enlightened knowledge to good use on behalf of the community, basically. You can kind of think of it like that. So, and these are magical rituals, they're things for like protection from evil spirits, uh, enhancing the quality of life of the community, that kind of thing. So again, this is actually in complete opposition to the understanding of magic as being selfish and antisocial, right? And here in this case, it's actually the magical practices that are in fact promoting social cohesion, you could say. The last term, the last Tibetan term that is often kind of related to magic or understood as being a kind of similar to magic or defined as magic is tu. And tu is actually often, or sometimes at least, translated as sorcery. Now, sorcery is a kind of a it's related to the term magic, and it usually has a kind of a sinister quality to it. The tu is also kind of more literally translated as power or force, but it's a kind of a magical force or power that is the context I've seen it in most often actually is in relation to certain protector deities who have power to cause these magical effects in the world, right? But it has it has a kind of a sinister cast to it, in the kind of a similar way as like when we say black magic or witchcraft. Although that's not to say that in the context I've seen it used most often, even though it has a kind of a sinister quality, it's often used in a positive way, but in a kind of a darkly positive way, like for killing people, right? Killing enemies of Buddhism, that kind of thing. Okay, now I also wanted to talk about how kind of the mechanics of magic in very briefly, the mechanics of magic in Tantric Buddhism. Like how do you get magical powers in Tantric Buddhism? And I'm focusing so much on Tantric Buddhism specifically because Tantric Buddhism is kind of the main form of Buddhism in Tibet, right? It has the most advanced tantric form of Tantric Buddhism in the Buddhist world, comes from Tibetan Buddhism, and was preserved in Tibetan Buddhism most in the most detail, I guess you could say. Okay, so in the mechanics of Tantric Buddhism, how do you gain magical powers? Very briefly, and in just in a very general sketch here. So, in the kind of the normative way Tantric Buddhism is practiced, and the normative way magical powers are understood to be gained, is that these magical powers are tied to or related to specifically the generation stage, what's called the generation stage of tantric practice. Now, there are two main phases of tantric practice: the generation stage and the completion stage. These magical practices we've been talking about are related more to the generation stage. Now, I've seen some like commentaries where magic is the ability to have magical powers is also connected in some ways to, and in some forms, to the completion stage. But most often magical practices are related to the generation stage, the first stage of tantric practice. And this is what's known as deity yoga. And this is and in deity yoga, in what's called sadhana, which can be translated as kind of spiritual practice, something like that. In deity yoga sadhana, you essentially self-identify as an enlightened being. And here's one such enlightened being in Tibetan Tantric Buddhism, Vajrabhairava, extremely wrathful deity who is also particularly associated with, magic, and in particular, this kind of sinister sorceress magic, what we might call black magic. And the idea is that in deity yoga sadhana, you are it's a kind of a ritualized, controlled spirit possession, right? You're drawing the deity into yourself. And once you do that, you are effectively channeling the deity's power, including their magical power. So now not all deity yoga is necessarily about self-possession or self-identification. Kind of the earlier tantras, what are known as Kriya Tantra, were more focused on invoking a kind of a deity, an enlightened deity, but not necessarily self-identifying as that deity. But the kind of the goal in Kriya Tantra is to sort of tap into or summon the power of that deity in order to accomplish a magical act, right? In order to produce some kind of magical effect in the world. So again, it's not where in certain forms of magic where it's just the practitioner himself is sort of tapping into kind of impersonal forces in the world. Rather, you are kind of channeling the power of a deity, of a Buddha, when you're doing these magical actions. And again, that kind of breaks down this dichotomy between religion and magic. Like, is this supplicative? Is this coercive? Well, it's a little bit of both. Like, you pray to the deity, but you're also there's a kind of a coercive quality to how you're drawing down their power, right? So that kind of hard and fast distinction between religion is supplicative, magic is coercive, that doesn't really apply here. Another way that magical action is accomplished in these tantric rituals is again kind of like what I was saying about Kriya Tantra, where you invoke a deity, but you don't necessarily self-identify as that deity. And this is mainly how protectors are used in Tibetan Buddhist ritual, right? You kind of you summon the deity, and then you command them to execute some kind of magical action. And this is Pendon Lhamo, one of probably the most important female protector in Tibetan Buddhism, tied very strongly to the lineage of the Dalai Lamas. And there is definitely in protector deity practices, there's definitely a coercive quality, where you, especially with lower, not necessarily enlightened protector deities, there's a sense that you're kind of forcing them to do what you want. And when you do this, and this is kind of an extension of deity yoga, right? Where you can't do this kind of thing. You can't command a protector deity as an ordinary person. You have to take on the form of an enlightened Buddha, usually oftentimes a wrathful deity like Vajrabhairava, in order to be able to command the protector deities, right? Otherwise, like, ordinary human being, protector deities are not going to listen to, right? But these enlightened Yidam deities, as they're called, they will. There's also an interesting sense in protector deity practice when you're doing hostile magic, when you're killing someone from a distance with we could call black magic, that the protector deities are actually shielding you from the karmic consequences of these actions. Because they're the ones who are doing the killing, not you, which is I kind of just love that detail. Okay, now let's talk specifically about black magic. Which is in the fourfold typology that I listed earlier. Again, this is the fourth, the Drak, the wrathful type, and it's the type that's the most dangerous, in the sense that obviously it's dangerous against the target of who you are attempting to kill with it, but it's also dangerous to you, because if it's not, or potentially at least, because if it's not done properly, and if it's not done with true altruistic intent, then you create very heavy negative karma, and can send yourself to hell by engaging in these practices. But these are very, very dark practices, and there's a lot of literature in Tibetan Buddhism on this kind of magical action, on this kind of magical ritual. And get a sense of how hostile these practices are in the kind of the narrative literature about these practices. There's a kind of a standard phrase that's used when someone is struck by this hostile magic, which is that they vomit blood and die, right? So now now when I say black magic, I kind of use that in two ways. One is a kind of an etic sense, and one is an emic sense, right? When I say black magic, in European culture and Western culture, we understand black magic as being specifically types of magic that's used to harm other people, right? Which is what this is in the Tibetan Buddhist context. But it's also, I also call it black magic for another reason, which is that in tantric in tantric typology and in tantric definitions of different types of magic, this type of magic, the hostile type, is coded as black. So in the four types of magical action, pacification is associated with the color of white, enrichment is associated with the color yellow, and overpowering associated with the color red. And finally, Drak, or ferocity, wrath, is associated with the color black. Now, okay, just to mention here, this picture here is of what's known as a linga, and this is used, not related to Shiva linga. It's it's the same word, but it's not. There's no connection there, as far as I know. But these linga are commonly used in these black magic practices in Tibetan Buddhism, as essentially like voodoo dolls, right? They're sort of meant to be a representation or an effigy of the person that you're targeting, and you destroy or stab or burn the effigy in the course of the magical ritual as a way of sympathetic, causing through sympathetic bonds, your target to be destroyed. Now, these kinds of practices were just like in Western magic, are or were extremely controversial. It's like in many texts, these practices are portrayed as being totally legitimate methods for an advanced tantric practitioner, a bodhisattva, to protect people by killing invading armies and that kind of thing. Other texts, though, are much more uncomfortable with this kind of practice, and oftentimes this kind of practice is strongly condemned, but in certain narrative texts and certain commentaries and so forth. So there was this tension in Tibetan Buddhism, and I think still exists, that whether these kinds of hostile black magical practices should be considered to be sinful and very bad thing to do, or they can be considered a legitimate, skillful means for basically compassionate action. Like I said, sometimes you need to kill someone to protect someone else. And I think these two approaches towards different understandings of these hostile magical practices are perfectly perfectly illustrated in the difference between how these practices are depicted in the biography of Milarepa on the one hand, and the biography of Lotsawa on the other. Now, both of these figures are highly regarded, considered to have been enlightened spiritual masters. Milarepa's biography in particular is considered to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest, uh, examples of spiritual literature produced by Tibet, but produced by Tibetan Buddhism. Lotsawa and of course Milarepa himself is extremely famous, around the world, even as a great Tibetan saint, a great Tibetan Buddhist saint. Lotsawa is not as well known outside of Tibetan Buddhism, but he's still quite famous. And right off the bat, you'll notice a very distinct difference between how the two of them are depicted, right? With Milarepa being a very peaceful sage, and Lotsawa having this very wrathful appearance and being dressed in the accoutrements of a sorcerer, of a practitioner of magic, especially his black hat here. You'll notice this black hat is particularly in Tibetan Buddhism is particularly associated with the practice of magic, and specifically black magic, hostile magic, wrathful magic, we'll say. Now okay, so my original point here is that in the biographies of these two figures, this kind of hostile magical practices are depicted extremely differently, in polar opposite ways, in fact. In the biography of Milarepa, quite famously took revenge against his aunt and uncle, actually, who were kind of abusing and mistreating and exploiting him and his mother and sister. He took revenge against them at the prompting of his mother, by learning very special, secret magical practices and turning in them against his evil relatives, basically. And there's this famous scene in Milarepa's biography where he casts these magical spells, which causes a house to collapse and kills a bunch of people inside. Later, he goes on to summon hail, which is a very common type of black magic in Tibetan Buddhism, hostile magic in Tibetan Buddhism, because hail was a plague in kind of one of the worst types of weather you could experience. Like if you got hit by hail at the wrong time of year, it could destroy your crops and cause famine. So hail was an extremely feared natural phenomenon in pre-modern Tibet. So, and one common type of black magic is to actually summon hail against your enemy's crops. And that's what Milarepa did. And it caused lots of misery in his home village, actually, when he did this. Now, Milarepa's biography depicts this as being a very bad thing to do. Um, at least the most famous version of Milarepa's biography. There's some earlier biographies where these magical practices are treated in kind of a more neutral way. But in the most famous um, of Milarepa's biographies, the black magic that he commits is considered to be a extremely bad thing to do, and the guilt of doing this drives him is a motivation, like a key motivation for him to going on his spiritual journey and seeking true dharma with which that he can achieve enlightenment, purify his bad karma and achieve enlightenment. The in Lotsawa's biography, on the other hand, or as he's known in kind of the nickname, you could say Rollo. Rollo was a adept of the secret practices of Vajrabhairava, which is again this deity here. And in fact, Lotsawa is known specifically as being the translator of the Vajrabhairava Tantras from Indian languages into Tibetan. Now, in Lotsawa's biography, in distinct contrast to Milarepa's biography, these kind of hostile magical practices, as black magic practices, are depicted as being actually very good. They show the intense power, the such great power of the Vajrabhairava techniques, the Vajrabhairava practices. And his biography is full of examples of him slaying his rivals, including wiping out entire villages with magic. And again, this is cast in a kind of an altruistic way, right? Where he kills people as a way of liberating them. These are bad people. They're hostile. They're against him. They don't appreciate and they don't follow the Vajrabhairava practices. So Rollo kills them as a way of liberating them. So it's actually a technique of salvation. And again, it said that not just anybody can do this. You have to know how to, carry the person's consciousness to Pure Land or into what's known as the Dharma Dhatu, the kind of the sphere of reality where they achieve enlightenment. It's more elaborate than just killing them. But a key part of the process of liberating them with black magic is, you cast the spell, they vomit blood and die. So one thing I forgot to mention in relation to Milarepa is that in Milarepa's biography, his magical teachers are the teachers the masters who taught him black magic are from what are known as the Bon and the Nyingma schools, specifically of Tibetan Buddhism. And this is interesting because historically, magic, these kind of magical practices that we've been talking about, are not exclusively associated with these two schools, the Bon and Nyingma school, by any means. because, for example, Rollo was actually not, well, he was not Nyingma. He was part of what's known as the Sarma tantric adepts who were bringing in new tantric techniques that were considered to be even better than the old ones, which is what Nyingma means, the old school of Tibetan Buddhism. But historically, the Bon and the Nyingma are particularly associated with magic, and specifically black magic. For example, the Nyingma treasure texts, which are these texts that are believed to have been buried in the earth, centuries ago by Padmasambhava, the kind of the tantric master who brought Buddhism, specifically Tantric Buddhism, to Tibet. He's said to have buried these treasure texts all around Tibet, and to be rediscovered in later times. And these treasure texts, many of them are just absolutely filled to the brim with these kinds of magical practices, specifically wrathful magical practices. And so the Nyingma are known as being kind of as specialists, and the Bunpos as well, as being as specialists of this kind of magic, and specifically the wrathful type of magic. And also historically, because of that, they've been marginalized and oppressed. Like there are certain instances where Nyingma monasteries were targeted for destruction and their inhabitants put to the sword because and Bonpo as well, because there's Nyingma are basically considered to be sort of heretical because of their association with these hostile magical practices. And again, here again we see magic. Of course, Tibetans were using different terms, but if we say that these practices are if we define these practices as magic, again we see these examples where magic is used as a way of othering, as an othering tool, right? It's this bad thing that other people are doing, and we need to stop it, or get rid of it. By no means is that the case all the time in Tibetan Buddhism. As I've said, the practice of magic is quite normative to Tantric Buddhism, but I would say maybe there's a perception of a kind of a overabundance of the sort of dark magic, black magic in certain schools that gets them into trouble sometimes, you could say. Okay, so now I wanted to kind of just end on discussing or showing examples of we could say three magical spells that I've taken out of a particular text, that I've worked on in particular, so I know it particularly well. This text is called The Collection of Activities. It's actually an 18th century redaction of a much older Nyingma treasure text. So again, those treasure texts full of magical spells that I was just discussing. This is a kind of a later edited version of one of those treasure texts. And these are kind of interchangeable magical rituals that can be kind of associated with any deity in particular, right? You can use, as long as you're proficient and adept at generation stage, the generation stage of tantric practice, you can do these rituals. And also, as long as you have an altruistic intention, the text specifies that. As long as you have an altruistic intention, and also you are adept at generation stage practice, No matter what deity you invoke, you can do these practices. But in this specific text, these rituals are associated specifically with this deity here, Sangwon Yeshe Khandro, or Secret Wisdom Dakini, which is kind of a sort of enigma form of Vajrayogini, a very kind of a rare form, rare deity form. Okay, so I just pulled out three magical spells from this text, more or less at random, to just kind of show you what these kinds of magical rituals in Tibetan Buddhism are like. And there's a lot of cross similarity between these rituals, these Tibetan Buddhist rituals, with Indian magic, non-Buddhist Indian magic, but also in, like, for example, the Greek magical papyri, from the ancient Greek context. You see short spells in lists that are kind of similar to this kind of thing. Okay, so the eighth spell in the list in the text is, if you wish to have great power and strength. And I think this means physical strength, although it's not entirely clear, but I think it's referring to physical strength. Meditate on yourself as the wrathful deity, great strength, Mahabala. And at the end of the root mantra, and now whenever it refers to the root mantra, it means it's referring to the mantra of this deity here, the Secret Wisdom Dakini. So you recite that mantra first, and then you recite the secondary mantra, Mahabala Pushtim Kurusoha, single-pointedly. Smear your body with the bone marrow of an elephant, dress in a fur cloak made of the hide of a carnivorous animal, and if you avoid fire and the sun, you will increase your physical strength. So again, this gets back to what I was saying before about the kind of the magic as alterity. Like there's a sense here that you have to do stuff that's sort of outside the bounds of ordinary religion, in order to cause the magical effect. So again, you got to smear yourself with bone marrow, dress in the hide of a carnivorous animal specifically, and in order to gain magical strength. Okay, the 12th spell. If you wish to accomplish the action of suppression, prepare an effigy, and by effigy here they mean this refers to this kind of thing, right? This sketch of a tied up, bound person, that's used basically as like essentially the same function as a voodoo doll. Prepare an effigy for the suppression of enemies and obstructors. Summon and dissolve them into it. So when it says summon and dissolve, what that means is you visualize the person that you're targeting basically turning into light, and then dissolving. That light goes into the linga, the effigy. So you say the root mantra, then you recite this other mantra, and then you pelt the effigy with mustard seeds and place them under a curse. Wrap it up in a corpse shroud and insert it into the skull of a leper, or the skull of a person whose lineage has ended. So here we see a kind of a sympathetic bonds being exploited, right? And this is a kind of a big thing in Fraser's definition of magic specifically. Fraser, this idea that magic could be defined as, or one of the big aspects of magic was that how it employed or exploited sympathetic bonds between things. So you're putting this this effigy inside of a skull of a leper or a skull of a person whose lineage is ended. That's, of course, has a very negative valence to it. It's kind of part of the way that you curse the person. Wrap the skull in yak hair fabric, and on a good day for wrathful actions, and this is referring to astrology, where you have to have kind of certain astrological knowledge to know which days are good to do which things on. There are certain days where it's good to do wrathful activities. So on a day that it's good to do wrathful activities, bury it under the foundation of an old reliquaries. Enemies will not appear. So this is a way of stopping enemies or protecting yourself, basically. 15th, if you wish to, again, the number refers, this is a whole numbered list. There's like 72, no, more than that, 92, I think, in this particular text. So the 15th one, if you wish to overpower a woman, and again, this goes back to the erotic magic that I mentioned before, which is often mistakenly called love magic, and again, love has nothing to do with it. If you wish to overpower a woman, make an effigy made of dough imbued with her family name and mixed with urine. Put it on a copper tray and forcefully summon and dissolve her soul into it. After the root mantra, say the name of this woman, and then you say this mantra, and then remain silent for 3 days. Every now and then, pelt the effigy with the fruit of a thorn apple, white mustard seeds, and the blood of a grouse. Then soak the effigy with your urine, and when it dissolves, bury it on the path on which that woman would likely walk. She will be attracted to you without effort. Now, when I mentioned before about how Kriya Tantric texts, the kind of the lowest, considered to be the lowest form of Tantra, are, I described them as being basically like grimoires of magical spells. It's this kind of thing. Maybe not necessarily this extreme in like the way of using like urine and that kind of thing, but the kind of these brief explanations of, if you want to do this, you take this thing, you recite this mantra, and then you do a specific action with the thing that you've empowered with the mantra. That's kind of the standard structure of all these kinds of magical spells. Okay, that's basically all I wanted to talk about. I also kind of just wanted to plug my new book about Tibetan magic, which it came out earlier this year. I co-edited and contributed in an article to it, and if you're interested in learning more about and specifically seeing more specific examples of Tibetan magic, and also lots of different ways that we can think about what magic is and different definitions of magic and how we apply that to Tibetan Buddhism. Of course, strongly recommend that you check this out. And yeah, so that's basically all I had. I guess I kind of went well over time, but I don't know if we want to take some time for questions now, if there's any.
Thank you so much, Cameron. No worries about a few minutes over time. And yes, indeed, if anybody has questions, I see one in the chat, Cameron, from Mike. If you could read it out, maybe. You see
Where
it?
is chat? I don't
Middle.
see the
Okay,
chat.
I can read it out for you.
Yeah,
Are
can you read
there
it?
specific schools of magic in the Tibetan tradition?
Sorry, say that again.
Are there specific schools of magic in the Tibetan tradition?
Um, Well, sort of, you could say that. There aren't specifics. I think I know what you mean in there, like there are specific, not exactly in the same sense as there are specific schools of magic in Western magic, I wouldn't say, but there are specific schools of, so I mentioned how in Tibetan Buddhism, magic is tied specifically, or the kind of the normative use of magic is tied specifically to, the generation stage and deity yoga. And there are different tantric lineages that are tied to or focused on specific deities. So I was talking about Lotsawa. He's from the Vajrabhairava lineage, which you can kind of think of as being its own. It's not really its own school, but it has its own specific set of practices, and including magical practices. There's also the Chakrasamvara lineages that have their own specific magical practices. Um, so, but that said, so there's different techniques to doing magic, but it often kind of there's so much intermixing and interchanging that all the different schools of Tibetan Buddhism have basically all the same types of magic. So kind of not real, I would say, in answer to your question, not really, but sort of, in that there's different lineages of different techniques. You could say that. Oh, I see
Thanks,
what you.
and I see there's another question below, actually two more. And the first one being, how are the collections of spells, grimoires, and oral teachings combined in the teaching and use of magic in Tibetan Buddhism? I suppose by which perhaps.
Yeah, that's a good question. So, like all of these, all tantric practices, not just those that are related to these magical techniques, magical spells. There's it's strongly based on oral transmission. So unless you have had a a guru or a lama, someone who is proficient in these practices already, they have to transmit these practices to you and explain them to you orally, give you actual explanations of them before it's considered that you have the capacity to practice them yourself, right? So if you're not an initiate of the tradition and you just pick up this text and try to practice it, at best, nothing will happen. At worst, you'll commit heavy negative karma that will end up, sending you to hell. So the grimoires, as you mentioned, have to be transmitted as oral teachings. That's the normative understanding, right? And unless you do that, you don't have the power, and in some cases, in many cases, in fact, you literally won't understand how to do the magical ritual unless you get an oral explanation about it. Like, for example, the spells that I just described, it would actually be kind of like, unless you had someone to explain to you and to show you how to do these things, it would actually be kind of difficult to just kind of pick up and do it on your own, right? So yeah, there's a very intimate connection between these grimoires and oral teachings.
Thank you, Cameron. And there's one last question in there from Cecilia, asking if you could please explain about the potential chronology of magic in Tibetan Buddhism and interaction with earlier pre-Buddhist practices.
Right. Yeah. That's a very sort of that's very difficult to answer. Because it's not at all clear. So kind of step back a little bit. In the early Western scholarship about Tibetan Buddhism, there was this kind of this assumption that a lot of these kinds of magical practices in Tibetan Buddhism had to be native Tibetan practices that were integrated into Buddhism, into Buddhist practice later. That's not necessarily probably the case in a lot of these cases, though. In some cases, that's likely what happened. And there are certain magical techniques that we don't see evident in Tibetan Buddhism that we don't really see evidence for in Indian Buddhism. But a lot of the magical practices, basically everything that I described today, we find in earlier Indian tantric texts. And so these practices, basically everything I just described, was practiced in Indian Buddhism first, and then was imported into Tibetan Buddhism. But again, that said, there are certain practices that I didn't talk about, stuff like thread cross, where you kind of these particular patterns where you made out of thread that you summon evil spirits into and then burn. That kind of thing, and other stuff as well, we don't see in, at least not to my knowledge, we don't see in Indian practices. So a lot of this magic comes from India and Indian Buddhism, and also just sort of Indian vernacular religion in general. It's not necessarily that this is specifically a Buddhist practice, like Hindu, even like Jainism employed some types of practices like this. But so it's kind of a general Indian practice that's not necessarily tied. So in that sense, a lot of this could be understood as being pre-Buddhist Indian stuff that was integrated into Buddhism in India and then imported into Tibet. But there are some practices that I didn't really talk about today that definitely seem to probably have been pre-Buddhist Tibetan stuff. But it's very hard to tell because we don't have there's no historical record in Tibet before the introduction of Buddhism. So it's very difficult to tell what practices existed in Tibet before Buddhism, became, kind of the mainstream religion. So, yeah.
Thank you, Cameron.